Do you ever think that you'd like to be queen for a day or king for a day? Do you ever think that you have royal blood in you and that someday you'll be a king or a queen? Or maybe right now you realize that maybe you are a princess. You know, our section lesson today is on kings and queens of England. And they had quite a few different feuds on who would be king or who would be queen in their royal blood. But you know, we really don't have to worry about that because in the Bible, in 1 Peter 2:9, it says, but you and me, we're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. And our Father in heaven loves us. And Jesus is our King of kings and Lord of lords. Isn't that cool? I just love that. Well, today we're going to have a couple lessons, and sometimes it gets kind of confusing. And some people, when they hear about the kings and queens of England, they go, oh no, I don't want to study that. That is just such a weird thing. It is kind of a weird thing because they were pretty much of a dysfunctional family, like most are. But towards the end, it feels like God showed up in the midst of all of that over the years. But where do we begin? Well, we begin where we left off. And if you don't remember, on lesson 70, we talked about the kings of England and the kings of France and how they were kind of related. And they had this 100-year war between France. They call it the 100-year war because of the 100-year between France and England. And in the between of all this, they had this terrible, terrible Black Plague going on. And, well, we end up with that because the king that we're going to start with tonight is that little baby boy who would have and could have been king of both England and France because his daddy was the king of England and his mommy was the princess of France, princess of the king of France. But that didn't happen. So we have, when we look, let's look back a little further, remember, Richard Lionhearted, back in the Crusades, and then he went to his last crusade, was his fighting when it started in the 100-Year War, and he was killed in the French War against France. And then, that 100-year war went on, off and on, and then it came to Henry. And Henry V. We can start with Henry II, and that was in 1154. But now we're going to go down to Henry V, which was like in the 1400s. He was probably the most famous English king, and you say, why was he so famous? Well, he was so famous because there was a guy, a playwright named William Shakespeare, and we'll be learning about him, who wrote a play about him, about Henry V. So he becomes like a very important, especially because we know a lot about him. But he was the one that was planning to get the English land back from France. And he's the one that fought the French in the French war there and fought against Charles. He was Henry V and it was Charles IV. They were fighting against each other. Well, they had this big war at Agincourt, and you guys remember that war, and it was in 1415, and it was a turning point of the 100-Year War because Henry went in, and he was ready to fight the French king, Charles, and there they are going to fight, but you see, Henry's army was not in any condition. They were tired, they didn't have any shoes, and they were worn out, and they weren't getting any sleep, and it was cold, and a lot of them were sick. But the French came in, but Henry stood up and gave this magnificent speech to his army and how they were brothers. And they woke them up, and they went to war. And despite all the circumstances, the English, Henry, won the war. Okay, but he wins this war, and then Charles VI gives his beautiful daughter, Catherine, to Henry as a wife. And they get married and they have this little boy, as I said, and he is Henry VI. And he's a 1-year-old. Well, it wasn't too long after that both Henry V and Charles IV, they both died not too long after that. So Henry, of course, is a baby, so they have someone rule in his stead there. And as he gets older, we start this whole thing about the War of the Roses. It all has to do with Henry VI. And you say, how can this all have to do with Henry VI? It's kind of a weird thing, because the War of the Roses is about cousins fighting for the throne, the Lancasters and the Yorks. The Lancasters, on their coat of armor, they had a big red rose, and on the Yorks, they had a big white rose. And they were cousins. Yeah. Well, what made them fight? Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. You see, Henry VI, this baby son ruler, grew up. He was a good man, but he really didn't want to be king. He'd rather not be king. He spent hours and hours in prayer, and he liked to go to church, and he liked to read and all these things, but he really didn't like to rule. He was a reader, not a ruler. And he refused to have his enemies put to death. And he liked women that dressed very modestly. And he was very different. He wasn't like most of the kings had been before. And he was a king. He had no choice but to be the king. And sometimes he'd say to his wife and to his the priests and everything, would say, I just don't want to do this. And he'd say, they do so interrupt me day and night. I can hardly find time to read or do anything else. See, he didn't really want to be king. And then as time went on, he ended up in having this mental illness. It was pretty sad. You see, his son was born and they came in and said, Henry, you have a son. And you know what he did? He turned into a statue. He was totally like a statue. They call it a catatonic state or catatonic schizophrenia or whatever. It's a mental illness. And he turned into a statue. And he wouldn't talk and he wouldn't answer them and he wouldn't do anything. He just stood there like a statue. And so they end up taking him and bringing him out and trying to wake him up, hitting him and everything. But he just stared. It was quite a deal. So they had to get someone else to rule. You see, Henry actually inherited this weird mental disease from his grandfather, who was a French king. And he had a hard time too. You see, this French king, his grandfather, had the same thing. Only he would turn to a fit of catatonic state, and then he would think that he was made of glass. And if he fell down, he would break. And then he would go for a long time not letting anybody touch him. It was very weird, but it was a mental illness. And it was actually probably inherited down to Henry. So Henry was there, so he had to get well. And so until he got well, they had to pick someone. So they picked his cousins, the Duke of York. The Duke of York's, yeah, man, I get to be king for a while. Yes, poor Henry, thinking Henry would not get well. But after a few years, Henry got well. And then he wanted to be king. He didn't want his cousin to be king. So then we had this fight going on with the War of the Roses. And the War of the Roses basically started because the Yorks, the Duke of York, and the Lancasters. And one wanted it to be, of course, the Henrys to be king, and the other wanted the Edwards Yorks to be king. And so it got to be pretty confusing, and it got to be pretty terrible too. Because then Henry got better, and then the Duke of York came in to fight him, and they ended up killing the Duke of York. And then Henry's wife got really mad, and after they killed him, she put his head up on the top of the castle or wherever. And then it really got the Yorks mad, and so Edward's son got very mad, and so he had another army, and he headed another army, and Edward's son ended up conquering, or Edward's son conquering Henry's son, the Yorks conquering the Lancasters, and putting Henry in jail. And this went back, and then then Edward, I should say. I get mixed up in the Henrys and the Edwards, but then Edward thought he was the rightful king. And he was something else too. You see, he was like 19 years old, 6 foot tall. He was a good fighter and a good dancer, and he loved people, and he would remember names, and he'd greet everybody when they came in, and everybody liked him. But he had one problem. He was, of course, of the York side, and he loved this woman, and her name was Elizabeth Woodville. And so he went and got married to her secretly. The reason he didn't want to marry her outright, because he knew that his whole family, because guess what? She was a Lancaster. I mean, she was of the Lancaster, and the guy that she was married, the knight, was actually one of Henry VI's knights. And so he knew his family wouldn't. So here we had a chance for the two to come together, but instead it didn't really happen. You see, they ended up still fighting. As you go on, they ended up still fighting. Let's take a break, and I'll tell you some more about this weird, dysfunctional royal family. But it does end up with something.